It started as just another day in court. The room buzzed with a low hum as attorneys prepped their notes and the bailiff directed people to their seats. I was seated in the gallery, scribbling notes for a local outlet. My job was to cover the trial of Detective Carl Brannigan, a once-celebrated officer now facing serious charges tied to evidence tampering, intimidation of witnesses, and misconduct. It was supposed to be a routine pre-trial hearing. It was anything but. Presiding over the case was Judge Melody Carr, known across the state for her sharp legal mind and calm demeanor. She was respected, feared, even, by those who thought their titles made them untouchable. But to the public, she represented fairness, no matter who sat before her. Detective Brannigan didn't see it that way. He entered the courtroom in a pressed suit, shoulders tense, lips thin. His eyes locked onto Judge Carr like she was his personal adversary, not the neutral figure she was appointed to be. You could feel the charge in the air, unspoken, but alive. He didn't just want to win this case. He wanted to destroy her authority. When the judge denied his attorney's motion to suppress damning bodycam footage, Brannigan's demeanor cracked. He whispered something to his lawyer, who quickly tried to calm him, but the detective stood up, unprompted. "Your Honor, with all due respect," Brannigan began, his voice rising fast, "you're biased, and you've been against me from the start." Judge Carr didn't flinch. "Detective Brannigan, you are out of order. Sit down, or I will hold you in contempt." But he didn't sit. He stormed toward the bench. Gasps filled the room. The bailiff moved, but not fast enough. Brannigan was already there, jabbing a finger toward Judge Carr, his voice venomous. "You don't belong up there," he shouted. Then it happened, he raised his arm. The slap echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. The courtroom froze. No one moved. Even the security detail seemed caught off guard, as if their minds hadn't yet accepted what their eyes just witnessed. Judge Carr didn't fall. She didn't scream. She didn't even touch her cheek, though a faint red mark was already blooming on her skin. She stood tall behind the bench, her hands clenched at her sides, her eyes locked on Brannigan, not with fear, but with something colder. Measured. Unshaken. "Bailiff," she said, her voice level but commanding, "take him into custody. Now." Suddenly, the spell broke. Two officers lunged forward, wrestled Brannigan to the ground, and cuffed him as he shouted incoherently about conspiracies and character assassination. Gone was the calm, rehearsed man who had entered moments before. This was someone unhinged. The gallery erupted. Some spectators shouted. Others grabbed their phones. A man near me stood and screamed, "That's assault on a sitting judge." The courtroom had turned chaotic, but Judge Carr remained still, watching, recording every second in her mind like a true jurist. Brannigan's lawyer, pale and sweating, stumbled forward. "Your Honor, I can't explain that. I'm so sorry," but Judge Carr didn't respond. She turned to the clerk. "Adjourn this session. All further hearings related to Mr. Brannigan's charges are suspended. A formal contempt order and additional charges will be filed immediately." Then she stood and walked calmly out of the courtroom. The next few hours were a blur. News crews swarmed the courthouse steps. Courtroom video leaked within minutes. The footage was undeniable: Brannigan's rage, the strike, Judge Carr's silent strength. Social media exploded. Headlines screamed phrases like "assault on justice" and "courtroom meltdown shocks nation." But this was only the beginning. Behind closed doors, institutions began to turn. Sponsors. Unions. Colleagues. Brannigan's fall wasn't just imminent, it had already started. By the time the sun set that evening, Detective Carl Brannigan's name had been scrubbed from nearly every official page tied to the department. His decades of service, once plastered across awards and press releases, were quietly erased, buried under a storm of statements distancing every institution from his behavior. His badge was suspended within hours. Internal Affairs launched a second investigation, not into his past arrests, but into how a man like that had stayed on the force so long. Behind closed doors, people were panicking. Whispers of prior outbursts, hushed complaints, and supervisors who looked the other way began to circulate. That night, Judge Melody Carr released a brief but powerful written statement: "I will not be defined by another person's lack of discipline. The justice system must never reward intimidation or emotional instability. We are stronger than the voices that try to silence reason through fear." The statement went viral. Talk shows, podcasts, legal analysts, everyone had something to say. But what surprised most people wasn't just Brannigan's behavior, it was how quickly the tide turned against him. He'd always walked with the aura of invincibility, as if consequence didn't apply to him. That illusion shattered the moment he lost control in front of a live courtroom. In the following days, Judge Carr returned to the bench as if nothing had happened. She refused additional security detail. She refused to be moved to a private chamber. Her message was clear: this court doesn't bend. Meanwhile, Brannigan sat in a holding cell, awaiting a bail hearing of his own. And the most devastating part? His trial, the one that brought him to that courtroom in the first place, hadn't even begun yet. Inside the holding cell, Brannigan was a shadow of his former self. Gone were the smug looks and arrogant postures. He kept to himself, silent, eyes sunken. For the first time in his career, he had no shield, no badge, no department, no union rep to smooth things over. His attorney tried to reach him, but Brannigan barely responded. He wasn't concerned with his defense strategy anymore. All he asked was, "What are they saying about me out there?" The answer? Everything. Cable news ran back-to-back segments. How did a decorated officer spiral so fast? The danger of power without restraint. His former partners gave carefully worded interviews, each more damning than the last. We saw signs. There were moments. I thought someone else was handling it. But the most damaging voice came from inside the department itself. A young officer, only 3 years on the force, anonymously submitted a detailed statement. It was later confirmed and aired publicly. Detective Brannigan operated under the belief that his seniority made him immune. He spoke to people however he wanted, especially those he didn't respect. He once told me that some judges didn't deserve their robes, that some people had skipped the line. I didn't understand what he meant, until now. The backlash was no longer just about the incident. It had become a larger reflection of institutional arrogance, how unchecked authority could fester into something dangerous. Meanwhile, Judge Carr refused to fan the flames. She stayed silent, made no further public comments. But her silence wasn't avoidance. It was power. She let the facts speak for themselves. Brannigan's bail hearing was scheduled quickly. The prosecutor made a bold request: no bail. The courtroom was packed again, this time with national reporters. And when Brannigan was escorted in, wearing the orange jumpsuit of a detainee, the room buzzed. Not with fear. But with justice finally catching up. The bail hearing was swift, clinical, and devastating. Brannigan's attorney argued that his client was no flight risk, citing his years of public service, his ties to the community, and the high emotions that allegedly triggered the outburst in court. But the prosecution came prepared. They played the courtroom footage again, this time frame by frame, highlighting not just the assault, but the moment before, the deliberate walk, the clenched jaw, the focus in Brannigan's eyes. It wasn't a man losing control. It was a man making a decision. The prosecutor's voice was sharp. Your Honor, this is not just a disgraced detective. This is someone who believed the law did not apply to him, until it did. He did not act in fear or confusion. He acted out of entitlement and contempt. If released, we believe there is a genuine risk to the integrity of ongoing proceedings, witnesses, and the court itself. Then came the surprise. They submitted a sealed file to the judge, new information uncovered during the internal review. While the contents weren't revealed in open court, the judge's face darkened as he read. He looked up. Bail is denied. Brannigan barely reacted. His attorney lowered his head. Outside the courthouse, the statement echoed through every news cycle, no bail for former detective who assaulted judge. By that evening, the department issued a final press release: Carl Brannigan has been officially terminated from service, effective immediately. His pension? Frozen. His commendations? Revoked. His legacy? Erased. The man who once strutted into courtrooms as a star investigator now faced trial as an inmate, his entire reputation burned away by a single, violent decision. The trial that followed wasn't just about the slap. That moment had triggered something deeper, a full-scale investigation into Brannigan's history on the force. Complaints long buried surfaced. Old cases were reopened. Former defendants stepped forward. Some described intimidation, others hinted at altered reports and coerced statements. Judge Carr, despite being the target of the original assault, recused herself from the criminal trial, refusing to let personal involvement compromise the process. The system must hold, even when individuals within it fail, she said. The courtroom was now presided over by a different judge, stern, impartial, and deeply aware of the public scrutiny surrounding the case. Brannigan's defense tried to lean into exhaustion, stress, and emotional instability. They painted a picture of a man fraying under the weight of pressure. But the prosecution was relentless. They methodically laid out a pattern of behavior: the power plays, the intimidation tactics, the private remarks caught in bodycam footage he forgot to turn off. Then came a powerful moment. A woman named Dana Ellison, a public defender, testified about an encounter with Brannigan years earlier. He'd cornered her in a hallway after a tense hearing and told her, "People like you don't last in this world unless you stay in your place." Her voice didn't tremble as she repeated it on the stand. The court went silent. This wasn't just about one act of violence. It was a pattern of targeting, of arrogance, of treating the courtroom as a personal domain rather than a place for justice. And now, it was all unraveling. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Their verdict: guilty on all counts, felony assault on a public official, obstruction of justice, and contempt of court. Brannigan didn't look surprised. In fact, he barely looked at anyone. No apology. No expression of remorse. Just a blank stare, like a man who finally realized the walls were real and closing in. The sentencing came 2 weeks later. The courtroom was packed, once again. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but journalists live-tweeted every word. Judge Halberd, the presiding judge, read the sentence with absolute clarity: Carl Brannigan used his position to intimidate, to belittle, and ultimately to physically attack a sitting judge. The court cannot and will not overlook the breach of that sacred trust. You are hereby sentenced to 11 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 7. Gasps. Silence. Brannigan was led out in cuffs, no longer a detective, no longer a man protected by the badge. The message was unmistakable: no one is above accountability, not even those who once enforced the law. Outside the courthouse, Judge Melody Carr emerged briefly to speak to reporters. Her statement was short, but firm: this was never about me. This was about the standard. The court belongs to no one, it belongs to the people. She stepped back, nodded once, and disappeared behind the courthouse doors. But the story didn't end there. Because something unexpected began to happen in the weeks that followed, something no one could have predicted. In the aftermath of the trial, a quiet ripple turned into a wave. Judge Carr's composure, her refusal to retaliate emotionally, and her unwavering commitment to principle struck a chord far beyond the legal world. Law schools began using her response as a case study. Editorials praised her not for her restraint, but for her strength in the face of provocation. But something even more meaningful happened: a series of reopened cases began surfacing, cases originally investigated by Brannigan. Some of them had always felt off. The outcomes didn't make sense, the evidence too conveniently placed, the confessions too perfect. Now, under new review and forensic analysis, 2 convictions were overturned in a single week. Both defendants had served over a decade behind bars. And both had been prosecuted based on investigations led by Brannigan. This changed everything. Public trust in the department, already shaken, began to fracture. The district attorney ordered an external audit of every case Brannigan had touched in the last 15 years. A task force was created, independent of city politics, and granted full authority to subpoena and question officers who had once worked beside him. The deeper they dug, the clearer the picture became. Brannigan's misconduct wasn't an isolated event, it was systemic. His behavior had gone unchecked for years, supported by a silent chain of those too afraid, or too complicit, to speak out. And now, thanks to a single moment of courtroom violence, all of it was unraveling. Judge Carr, though not directly involved in the investigations, became a quiet symbol of a shifting tide, the kind of leadership that doesn't flinch under pressure, doesn't strike back, and never steps down from truth. And for Brannigan, sitting in a cold prison cell, the worst part wasn't the sentence. It was knowing that everything he tried to control was finally out of his hands. The fallout didn't stop with Brannigan. As the task force released its interim report, the findings rocked the entire department. 5 current officers were suspended. 2 former supervisors resigned before internal interviews could even begin. Whistleblowers were stepping forward, many of them rookies during Brannigan's reign, telling eerily similar stories. He taught us that intimidation was a tool. There were unspoken rules: don't question him, don't contradict him. He made it clear certain people just weren't worth defending. The city council held emergency hearings. The police chief, once a vocal defender of Brannigan, now had to answer for years of silence. One senator publicly called for a federal review of the entire precinct's past cases, while others pressed for reform legislation to increase accountability inside law enforcement ranks. Meanwhile, the 2 men exonerated from Brannigan's cases filed lawsuits against the city. Their interviews were hard to watch, men broken not just by years behind bars, but by the knowledge that their freedom had been stolen by someone who was supposed to uphold the law. One of them, Michael Reyes, stood outside the courthouse with his daughter and said, "I spent 13 years locked away while that man walked free. And it only stopped because a judge stood her ground. I don't hate him. I pity him. But I'll never forget what he took." Judge Carr declined all requests for interviews. She continued her docket as normal, issuing rulings with the same unwavering calm. But every time she walked into her courtroom, the room got just a little bit quieter. Not from fear. From respect. 6 months later, the city looked different. Brannigan's trial had not only exposed a single man's downfall, it had forced a long overdue reckoning. Policies changed. Independent oversight was expanded. Anonymous reporting channels were opened for officers and civilians alike. Training programs were restructured to focus not just on tactics, but on integrity. The precinct that once shielded Brannigan now bore a new motto, painted above its entrance: accountability is strength. And yet, Judge Carr never once claimed credit. She turned down media deals, refused book offers, and declined every invitation to speak on the talk show circuit. Her focus remained exactly where it had always been, on the bench, behind the robe, in the courtroom where the law was meant to serve everyone, not just the powerful. The final chapter of Brannigan's story came quietly. A photo leaked online of him in prison, older, thinner, staring off into space during a midday meal. It wasn't shared widely. There was no public celebration of his downfall. No viral post. No dramatic moment of closure. Because the victory had already happened. It happened the moment the courtroom chose order over chaos. The moment a judge stood firm while others buckled. The moment a system, for once, chose to correct itself, no matter how uncomfortable. Justice wasn't loud. It was steady. And that, in the end, was what truly ended his career, not just the slap, not just the trial, but the quiet, immovable strength of the very system he tried to bend. And the woman who wouldn't let him.